is that the genocide in Gaza right now is happening, and the human rights catastrophe in Lebanon is happening exactly and precisely because of the complete moral failure of the Islamic world. And I'm speaking not of the people in the Islamic world, but specifically the ruling elites and governments, especially in the Arab world. Well, I think there's been a significant public opinion shift, but one has to make distinctions because public opinion in the West and the United States in particular, where I currently live, is not monolithic. So I think the biggest shift has taken place among young people, people who are roughly under the age of 35, and they are generally outraged over what the United States is backing in the Middle East, specifically with respect to the war in Gaza. You can see this clearly in public opinion polls. You can see this in terms of support that exists in the Democratic Party among the base of the party, particularly young people who want and are demanding that the Biden administration shift its policy to stop backing Israel so unilaterally and to be more fair and just toward the Palestinians. But I think at the as you make distinctions, as you look at the older generation of people, let's say above the age of 40, they tend to be more pro-Israel. They tend to be, connected to a view of Israel that existed in the United States in the 1950s and 60s, where Israel was perceived as an underdog, as a victim, as a sort of a country that was a democracy fighting for its life against adversaries that were intolerant and that were aggressive. One of the interesting shifts that's taken place is that support for Israel in the West used to be a left-wing issue. In other words, people on the political left of the spectrum used to be solidly pro-Israel. Now that it's completely flipped and turned itself upside down, where support for Israel now is overwhelmingly on the political right, in the Republican Party and the extreme right, where people on the left now, generally speaking, are Armenian. There are still distinctions that have to be made there, but that's an interesting and important reversal. The other distinction that I would make is at the level of ruling elites, the ruling elites of the Democratic Party, intellectual elites, there is still solid support for Israel. That has to do with many issues that we can discuss. It applies specifically to the Democratic Party. So if you listen to what Barack Obama, for example, has said, or what Hillary Clinton has said, they have been very vocal and very outspoken in supporting Joe Biden's policy toward Gaza. But within the Democratic Party and among sort of young people, there's a lot of outrage, anger, and demands for change. And I think it's the best representation of that were the campus university protests that broke out in April of this year, where at least 130 universities and colleges had campus protests that lasted many weeks. Some of them were brutally crushed. And according to data that I've seen, 4,000 students were arrested in the context of these protests. So that's how the picture looks to me. The Trump administration, or the Trump political party that's connected to the Republican Party, has not changed its rhetoric. In many ways, if there is a change, it's a change in favor of more support for Israel and what it's doing in Gaza. Just to cite one example that illustrates the point. Benjamin Netanyahu was here in Washington, D.C. at the end of July. He spoke to a joint session of Congress. He received 61 standing ovations, mostly Republicans, but also Democrats. This is after 9 or 10 months of a genocide. And he gets 61 standing ovations. He meets with Biden. He meets with Harris. He's given, among the ruling elites of the United States, a red carpet treatment. So among ruling elites, and especially the Republican Party, there's been no shift to recognize, what's happening in society. If there is a shift, it's a shift to the right in support of Netanyahu. The Democratic Party, it's a bit of a different picture. There's a lot of anger, animosity, demands for change among young people, including among young American Jews who are outraged by what Israel is doing in the name of Jews. And there's demands for change. Um, and you can see a slight shift in rhetoric when Kamala Harris came into the candidacy for president. She started to sort of, change the rhetoric, calling for, more support for the Palestinians. The Palestinians have the right to self-determination. But in my reading, that's simply a cosmetic series of statements that seeks to sort of address this growing anger among the Democratic Party, knowing that if a lot of young people don't vote, then that could make a big difference in terms of the outcome of the election. So the changing rhetoric is really, I think, cosmetic, very superficial. The policy is still the same. And it can be summarized as, almost 100% support for Israel among the Democratic Party, among Joe Biden, among, Kamala Harris. But there is a recognition there that, there's a lot of anger in the country. And so the other way that this manifests itself, if you listen closely to what the Democratic Party and the ruling elites are saying, they keep talking about, well, Palestinians deserve more humanitarian assistance. Israel has to, respect international law. So those types of things you hear consistently, and I think it's words that are meant specifically to address and acknowledge that there's a lot of anger in the party among young people. But of course, it never gets translated into a policy shift. But there is those slight rhetorical flourishes or rhetorical shifts that one can detect if one pays close attention to what the Biden administration and now the campaign for Kamala Harris is saying on this topic. If one wants to look to the anti-apartheid struggle and the movement to create a democratic South Africa and the mobilization that took place in the West and derive any lessons from that that can be applied to the case of the Palestinians, I think one has to identify several important themes here that are significant. Number one, the struggle against apartheid and sort of the calls for boycott and divestment was a movement that began a very long time ago as a marginalized movement, but it gradually picked up steam and it took many years to make a difference. It was also strongly supported by an organized and very principled leadership among the South Africans, led by Nelson Mandela and the African National Congress. They were very clear and insistent that part of the struggle required mobilizing global civil society and encouraging them to, prod their politicians and elected officials to change their policy. Now, the difference with Israel-Palestine is there's no organized or credible Palestinian leadership that's doing the same thing. That's a big difference. The other point that I would mention is that the conflicts are not exactly the same. It was very easy to mobilize against apartheid in the West because it was such a clear black and white distinction. There was no, for example, pro-apartheid South Africa lobby in the West that would try and openly, justify what South Africa was doing. In the context of Israel-Palestine, you have a very organized pro-Israel lobby that tries to influence this debate, often by weaponizing charges of anti-Semitism against pro-Palestine supporters and claiming that they're not really interested in a just resolution; they just hate Jews. And you can see that, for example, over the last year, where one of the big debates here in the United States that has been discussed in Congress is that a slogan such as "From the River to the Sea" or the word "Intifada" really is a code for Jewish genocide. Now, that might sound, crazy to some people that are listening to this a series of comments that I'm offering, but that is exactly how they're being interpreted and understood. And so when you compare that to South Africa, there's not a parallel situation that one can invoke. But I do believe, just taking a step back, that the struggle against apartheid that began, like I said, as a small movement, gradually picked up steam. One, because there was good leadership from the African National Congress that supported it. It gradually didn't give up. It sort of started as a small movement, but then it started to, influence different sectors of civil society, trade unions, the Hollywood and entertainment industry started to speak out. And gradually politicians in the West, realizing that this was an issue and that there was a core constituency that backed it, started to listen. So I think, one has to realize that these are long-term struggles. There's lessons to be learned. I think one also has to point out the distinctions and the differences. One of the big challenges, as I pointed out, is, there's a very strong pro-Israel lobby that wants to defend apartheid in Israel right now, and has a lot of influence where they can even, lobby and force the firing. Yeah, so one of the big differences in terms of comparing the struggle against apartheid in South Africa with the struggle against apartheid in Israel and the occupied territories is that you have a very powerful and organized pro-Israel lobby that in many ways wants to defend the status quo in Israel-Palestine, wants to defend the existing apartheid policies. They don't explicitly say that, but their defense of Israel effectively boils down to that position. So when in the 1980s, when I was active as a young student protesting against apartheid in South Africa, the opposition was there, but it wasn't the same opposition that we're facing right now. Back then the arguments that were used was that, look, Africans in South Africa, they're not able to rule themselves. The ANC is a communist party. If they come to power, the Soviet Union will take advantage of that situation. Those were the arguments that were invoked. Here and at this point, in the context of Israel-Palestine in the West, the arguments that are invoked to oppose a just resolution of the Israel-Palestine conflict is that those students who are organizing and calling for political change and a shift in U.S. foreign policy, they are charged with anti-Semitism. They are charged with Jew hatred. There's a very organized and sophisticated lobby that seeks to shift the debate in the United States, in the West, away from what Israel is doing in Gaza and what Israel is doing in the West Bank, and shift the debate to the question of anti-Semitism and say this is just, 1930s resurgent anti-Semitism. And you have many mainstream voices who believe this, and many members of Congress who believe this too. So those are some of the differences that have to be overcome. Of course, one of the positive developments in this case is that many of the people who are protesting right now on behalf of Palestinian suffering and Palestinian rights are Jews themselves, particularly young people who are drawing upon the best lessons of Jewish ethics and the Jewish ethical tradition to say, no, we are not going to allow the United States government to be complicit in genocide, and we certainly don't want Benjamin Netanyahu to speak on behalf of all Jews as he behaves in this outrageous manner. So those are, I think, some of the positive developments that one can determine and one can sort of identify with. Yeah, that's a good question. I think there's one takeaway is how this struggle for justice in Palestine and Israel is really a struggle that's being shaped by political power. One of the interesting takeaways is this, notwithstanding what Israel is doing to the Palestinians in Gaza, which is widely viewed to be a genocide, and that the United States is backing that genocide. And it's one of the unique genocides that in many ways is being televised to the world on a daily basis. And so we see the horrors and we see the human devastation on a daily basis. Nonetheless, the war continues and U.S. policy remains the same. And regardless of this upcoming election, whether it's Harris or whether it's Trump, there's no reason to believe there's going to be a shift in this policy. So I think one of the takeaways is that when you have power, and a lot of power, you can basically do what you want. And the challenge for the other side is how do you compete with your adversary, who is more militarily powerful, politically powerful, economically powerful. This is one of the big challenges of the Palestine solidarity movement. So you can see it right now, I mean, it's so bad that, when the Democratic Party had its, national convention or conference in August, they did not allow a Palestinian voice to be aired on the platform or to give a talk. While they were very well open to having American Jewish voices that were pro-Israel, that blatant double standard still exists, but it exists at the level of high politics, not at the level of the grassroots or in society or on university campuses. That type of discrimination would not be tolerated. So I think one of the takeaways is that we are aware that high politics is still very much controlled by powerful interests, political interests, who dominate the debate and shape policy. I keep coming back to this event that I think is a significant event in this story. Benjamin Netanyahu comes to the United States after he has been indicted by the International Criminal Court for war crimes, after the World Court has issued a statement that Israel is plausibly committing genocide. And he comes to the United States and he gets 61 standing ovations, and no one can do anything about that. So that's a reality check for people who, think that there's going to be any, shift in policy in the short term. On the positive side, I think one has to, you know, someone like me who's been involved in Palestine solidarity activity for most of my adult life, one can see things that I never thought I would see in my lifetime. Campus protests across the country, mobilizing and shaping the political debate, and sending shockwaves of fear to the powerful, political interests in this country that consume and shape global conversation for about 2 months. That's a significant turning point. Young people now in the United States, when they look at what's happening in Israel-Palestine, they are outraged, they're upset, and they're willing to sort of risk their own political careers and sometimes their own education. So there's been a very positive shift in society. The challenge now is how do you translate that public opinion shift into actual political gain and into political power. And there's no easy answers to how you do that. So that's I think one of the takeaways. The other takeaway I want to mention, since I'm talking to a Pakistani news organization, is that the genocide in Gaza right now is happening, and the human rights catastrophe in Lebanon is happening exactly and precisely because of the complete moral failure of the Islamic world. And I'm speaking not of the people in the Islamic world, but specifically the ruling elites and governments, especially in the Arab world, who all of them in various ways are complicit in this catastrophe. Publicly they express sympathy for the Palestinians, but privately they want Israel to win this war because they hate any organization or demands for political change. They hate the Palestinian cause because the Palestinian cause is a core marker of identity in the Arab and Islamic world. It mobilizes people and it forces people onto the streets and people ask questions of their governments. Just to cite one example of the complete moral failure and complicity of Muslim and Arab ruling elites is that the Arab world in particular is the biggest purchaser of weapons around the world, most of them Western weapons from the United States. Not one Arab or even Muslim country has been able to give one bullet or send one bullet to Gaza to stop a genocide. But all of these countries, when Iran was firing missiles toward Israel, mobilized their militaries and their intelligence capacities to protect Israel when Iranian missiles were headed in Israel's direction. And this is not to be taken as an apologia or apologetics for the government of Iran, of which I'm very critical of. It's just to highlight the contrast that Muslim governments have, and particularly Arab governments, and particularly oil-producing states, have a lot of leverage that they could use to stop this moral obscenity that we're seeing in the Middle East, but they choose not to do so. And so there's a lot to be said about the complicity, the failure of Arab and Muslim governments that have contributed to this catastrophe that we're seeing in the Middle East. And that's a subject perhaps for another interview. No one wants to address it, but I think as people who come from or are connected to the Muslim world, these are conversations that should be happening because it's a big part of why we're in this very